So welcome everyone. So this is our very last video for chapter 7 and it should be a relatively short one. So we're going to go through chapter 7E, which is looking at the role of the lymphatic system in the immune responses that we've been learning about over the last couple of videos. So what is this lymphatic system? So I've been talking about the bloodstream a lot because, most of our innate immune cells will use the bloodstream, and our complement proteins and things like that will use the bloodstream to enter sites of infection. But we also have the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system is very specific to immune responses, and it's normally where our adaptive immune cells are going to be traveling around. It's a large network of vessels throughout the body in which lymph flows. So lymph is just basically a fluid, like blood, but not like blood at all, but it's just a fluid that flows through these vessels. So the lymphatic system is sort of like the blood vessel system, so it's a very different purpose. So what it does is it acts as a transport system for antigen-presenting cells to secondary lymphoid tissues, and I'll go through that in a second. But basically what this means is that this is the main transportation system for an adaptive immune response and the activation of that adaptive immune response. So this is also where our immune cells are going to be born and created. And this is where a lot of them are going to mature as well. So let's go through these primary and secondary lymphoid tissues before I keep going. So over here and this guy over here, we've got two different types of lymphoid tissues. So these green vessels are the lymphatic vessels, the lymphatic system. And then we have our primary lymphoid tissues and our secondary lymphoid tissues. So our primary lymphoid tissues are where lymphocytes are produced. So it's where B and T cells are born, basically. So in the bone marrow is where our B and T cells are created. So this is a primary lymphoid organ because it is where B and T cells are created. For maturation though, B cells will remain in the bone marrow to mature, whereas T cells will move to something called the thymus. So the thymus is again a primary lymphoid tissue because it's involved in the production and maturation of our of our adaptive immune cells. So they're the two primary lymphoid tissues. So B and T cells are produced in the bone marrow. B cells will remain there to mature, and T cells will move to the thymus to mature. We also have a bunch of secondary lymphoid tissues. So they're in blue. So things like the spleen, tonsils, and lymph nodes. So this is where all of our sort of scanning and surveillance and antigen presentation, clonal selection, all of those things we've been learning about happen in these secondary lymphoid tissues. So primary lymphoid tissues is production and maturation. Secondary lymphoid tissues is where all of the action happens. So what's going to happen is our naive T cells and our naive B cells are going to be sitting there waiting in these secondary lymphoid tissues, basically waiting to be activated by a pathogen or an antigen presenting cell. While they're waiting, our antigen presenting cells will obviously phagocytose the antigen, often at the inflammation site, and they're going to use these lymphatic vessels to travel to the secondary lymph nodes where they can present antigen. So antigen presentation happens here. It's also where clonal selection and clonal expansion happens. So the selection and differentiation of B cells and T cells also happen here, and some production of leukocytes or white blood cells can also happen here as well. So you need to know the two different types of primary lymphoid tissues, what happens there, and you also need to understand what the secondary lymphoid tissues are with a few examples, and also understand what's happening in them as well. So this is just a good to know, not a need to know. It's just how the lymphatic system works. So it's a transport network for antigen presenting cells to travel from sites of infection to lymph nodes for antigen presentation and initiation of adaptive responses, like we said. So the diagram to the right shows how this system kind of works. So there's going to be fluids from blood vessels that leak into tissues, and this is what occurs during inflammation, as we know. So our lymphatic capillaries, which are also in tissues, are going to collect those fluids, which are also going to have pathogens inside, obviously, because that's the site of inflammation. So that's what's happening here. So alongside our blood vessels where our immune cells are coming in, we've also got our lymphatic tissues as well, which are going to collect fluids and pathogens and carry them to the lymph nodes. Then what's going to happen is our lymphatic vessels, so the muscles in here are going to squeeze lymph through this system, through these tiny vessels, and they always go in one direction. So all lymph fluid goes in one direction, unlike blood that goes in all different directions. It only goes in one direction, and that is to the lymph nodes. So that's all going in this direction to this lymph node here. And then once the fluid arrives there via afferent vessels, it's here where the antigen-presenting cells and the pathogens will meet with lymphocytes, which are T and B cells, and trigger all of those adaptive immune responses, presentation, clonal expansion, clonal selection, antibodies are made here, cytotoxic T cells are made here, and then they're going to use the efferent vessel and the lymphatic system to travel back to the site of infection so that they can do all of their jobs. So this is just like a summary of what happens here. So once our B and T cells are produced in the bone marrow and mature in their respective primary tissues, they're then going to move to the lymph nodes or maybe even the spleen or another secondary lymphoid tissue, and they're going to sit there and they're going to wait. And they're going to wait for either a pathogen to just, magically come through that lymph fluid, or they're going to wait for our antigen presenting cell, which is normally a dendritic cell, to travel through the lymph into the lymph node. And when it travels in there, you don't need to know any of this stuff. This is, beyond our course. But once it gets in there, what it's going to do is it's going to obviously present its antigen to its T helper cell, and then it's going to create this cascade event of clonal expansion, clonal selection, clonal differentiation, production of cytotoxic T cells, antibodies, depending on what the infection is, which you can see here. So this takes about 8 days. So remember I said in our last video, it's about 2 weeks before an infection can be cleared with the adaptive immune response, because this takes a really, really long time. It takes a long time for the pathogen or the dendritic cell to arrive at the lymph node, activate these responses, and then for the differentiation and expansion to occur. So this is where all the action is happening. It's happening in our lymph nodes, in our secondary lymphoid tissues. And then these, fully mature T and B cells are going to go off and they're going to fight whatever infection they need to. I hope this helps. Please bring any questions to class and I will see you there.